Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, it's time to make that courtesy check that our mobile devices of various sorts and ringtones have been silenced or turned off. It's always appreciated. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Leading our discussion today is Dr. Lee Edwards. Dr. Edwards is our Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought in the B. Kenneth Simons Center for Principles and Politics. He is chairman and founder of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, recognized historian and authority on the conservative movement, and he and a colleague here in the audience today can even claim to go back to 1962 and drafting the Goldwater campaign. So Lee, you can tell them a little bit about that as you discuss the history of our speaker and author. Please join me in welcoming Lee Edwards.
It's too long ago. I can't remember a damn thing about it. The Heritage Foundation and Speaker Gingrich go back a long way. Just after he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1978, he showed up at a Heritage brown bag luncheon and talked about the coming impact of computers in the home. He was always a visionary. In 1983, marking the dedication of our new headquarters at 214 Mass Avenue, Congressman Gingrich participated in a roundtable discussion of the future of conservatism. And the other participants were the Wall Street Journal's editorial page editor, Bob Bartley, historian Russell Kirk, and neoconservative founder Irving Kristol. And Newt more than held his own, as you might suspect. In a 1990 Heritage lecture, he said that only after 17 months as the House Republican whip, he had come to a sober and a somber conclusion. Congress was a broken, corrupt, and sick institution, quote, in an imperial capital that wallows in the American people's tax money. Rejecting the old Republican vision of balancing the budget above all, he declared that America faced a real turning point in its history and offered 5 goals that, if realized, he said, would create a prosperous, free country offering hope and opportunity to all. That sounds a lot like the Heritage vision. The Friday morning following the historic 1994 election, a landslide for Republicans, as we all remember, Newt Gingrich bumped into the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas in front of the U.S. Capitol. Quote, "Here we are," said Newt. "You're on the court over there, and I'm going to be speaker over there. Do you think that is what they mean when they talk about a revolution?" Speaker-to-be Newt Gingrich delivered his first public address following the 1984 election at the largest President's Club meeting in Heritage history. So here we are, and who better to tell Speaker Gingrich's extraordinary story than Craig Shirley, best-selling biographer, researcher extraordinaire, perceptive analyst of conservatives and conservatism. The historian and political analyst Michael Barone is correct. Craig Shirley has become the leading historian of modern conservative leaders. So Craig, let me begin by asking, why did you write Citizen Newt?
Because it was important, it needed to be done. Because, first of all, thank you very much, Lee, and thank you, Heritage Foundation, for inviting me here today. I'm not sure I agree with Mike Barone. I still think I'm second to you as far as the leading historian of the American right in America. So, but I'm working on it to catch up to you. Because virtually every book that's been written, and I'm going to probably embarrass Newt here a little bit, but virtually every book that's been written, other than Newt and a couple others down in Georgia, Mel Steele and others, were very bad because they were written by liberals with a political agenda. And so they were pushing an agenda instead of simply reporting the facts. And I've noticed over the time, over the years, is that as we go further down the road is that conservative thought and conservative history is in danger of being written into irrelevancy if we leave it to liberalism. I think of Rick Perlstein and his atrocious book on Ronald Reagan. And I think of other books that have been written by liberals about conservatives. And actually, it was Newt's idea. I've been working on my fourth Reagan book, and we had talked about it, and I quickly agreed to it. And it did take a number of years because I was working on December 1941. I was working on another Reagan book, so it took a little bit longer. And I entered into it, but I was open-eyed about it. I said I had to have unfettered access to him, his friends, family, his papers, and he couldn't interject any opinion into the book. He couldn't say this should be added, this should be taken out, this should be edited. Those were the strictures that I set down, and he agreed to it. So, but I think it's fair to say is that. And again, it's going to be embarrassing here for Newt, but if you go back the last 50 years, is that the four most important conservative leaders in America are obviously Reagan, Buckley, Goldwater, and Newt Gingrich. I think also he's worthy of study. Sound like you're a specimen or something. Because if you think about it, the arc of American history is that with the exception of presidents, like Nixon was on the national stage from the 40s right up until his passing. Reagan was on the national stage from the 40s right up until his passing. But on the other hand, Lincoln was on the national stage only for about 7 years. But think of people in national politics who are on the national stage for as long as Gingrich has been, Mr. Gingrich, Newt, the speaker, whatever. Henry Clay, yeah, 20, 25 years. William Jennings Bryan, 20, 25 years, but he was making national news as soon as he was elected in '78, going after Charlie Diggs, who was a very corrupt Democratic member, even before he was sworn in January of '79. So he was already making national press, and he's been continuously on the national stage. I mean, he just came here from a meeting at the White House advising Donald Trump. So I guess Newt is still relevant. So that in himself makes it worthy of studying why that book had to be written.
Mm-hmm. Newt, so have you read the book?
Yes. Yeah, we had an agreement. I looked at it purely for factual accuracy.
Yes.
And when it was in galleys.
So are you pleased with it? Are you embarrassed by it? Are you disappointed in it?
No, we'll see who gets embarrassed now. Well, I think, look, there are places where I would say that Craig's judgment of mine would be different. There were a couple places where my memory of a particular event is different contextually than his memory of it. On the other hand, I think it is fair to say that starting with his Reagan books, he is by a huge margin the most meticulous and detailed historian that I've ever worked with. And actually, his book on December 1941 is an even more vivid example of that. I found when I read it, I found myself learning so many different things that I had no notion of. And Craig has almost a 19th century discursive style in the sense that if he's in the middle of this story, but then he decides he wants to share with you, so you're having a conversation with Craig, and he'll go over here for a little while and tell you this story, and then he'll come back. And there are places where what you're getting is Citizen Newt as interpreted by Craig Shirley, and occasional swipes at liberals, because that's part of his, I think his mission in life is to try to rebalance the intellectual conversation. My biggest single response, to share with all of you, and I told him after I finished the book, I called him, my biggest response was exhaustion. I mean, I had forgotten how many different things we used to do. And he would go through, on this day he did this, on this day he did, as you went through it, you began to realize, and it was all real, I mean, we actually did it, but it was just an astonishing explosion of energy, particularly in the 16 years between getting elected and actually creating the majority in '94. And I think I had forgotten how many, and some of them just didn't work. And he captures this. I mean, we tried things that just didn't work, and but that's a part of the history of how you got there.
This is 500 pages, but I believe that it pretty much stops, doesn't it, with the contract with America?
Yeah, it stops the night of the
Yeah.
November election of
Right.
94. Yeah.
So Volume 2 will be coming out when?
Yes.
Right.
And
That's,
it's probably in another 7 years.
no. No, 10. No.
And of course,
Not-
that has a whole different richness, it's a totally different, I mean, the speakership is radically different than winning the majority.
Right.
And I think in that sense, although I think it's a little bit intimidating to be the person about whom somebody writes 500 pages to get you up to the moment people thought was when your career began. Because in this city, there's, there are lots of congressmen, but there are very few speakers. So you
No.
get different.
Reagan had a number of different careers, you've had a number of different careers, so
right.
you have to break them down in chapters.
But when you came to Washington, Newt, back there in 78, 79, where did you think you would wind up? I mean, how big was your ambition at that
I
point?
thought eventually I'd be at the Heritage Foundation having a conversation like this. No, look, I started in August of 1958 between my freshman and sophomore years in high school. And I had essentially three goals: to create a Republican majority, to replace the welfare state, and to defeat the Soviet Empire. And based on the premise that countries can die and that the quality of leadership is extraordinarily important about whether or not they die. And so I decided I had basically three jobs. This is literally just before my sophomore year in high school. Figure out what America has to do to survive, figure out how to explain it to the American people who will give you permission to do it, and figure out how to implement it once you have the American people's permission. And I've spent the rest of my life basically focused on that. When I arrived in December of 78, we'd already been in the minority for 24 years. And so I went to the chairman of the campaign committee and said, Guy Vanderjack of Michigan, and said, we ought to have a plan to become a majority. And he said, that is a terrific idea. Why don't you chair the planning committee? I hadn't even been sworn in yet. And so it did three things. It legitimized my thinking on a big scale. It gave me real resources. I mean, Joe Gaylord and I figured out one year that, probably over the years, the NRCC had subsidized my activities to the tune of $10 or $15 million. So you could do polls, you could do training, you could travel, you could do all the things you had to do to build a majority. And then third, it legitimized my dealing as a peer with the Republican National Committee. Remember, I'm only a backbencher. I've just arrived. I'm a freshman. But because Bill Brock was from Chattanooga, and we'd known each other back when he was a congressman and then when he was a senator, he was the Republican National Committee chair. So when he decided to bring Margaret Thatcher's advertising team over after she won in May of 79, it was natural to invite me to come to the meetings, because after all, I was chairman of the planning committee, and so I had a status that was absurd for a freshman. And I could go do all sorts of things, and I was quite cheerful about, I've always had a pretty good knack for taking whatever thin grant of authority I had and maximizing its plausibility. And you can get a lot of stuff done if you do that.
Yeah. Craig?
He mentioned.
What were the qualities
okay, go
that you saw that as you were beginning to develop your understanding of what made Newt Gingrich special? So what were some of the qualities? This is extraordinary, particularly for the young people in the audience. And we're talking about a 10th grader, 11th grader, with these great big visions. How was that possible? What was there about him that you saw?
I wasn't thinking like that when I was in 10th or 11th grade. I was thinking about sports and girls. But I think that, the two interesting aspects that Newt brings to the Republican Party, which are, I think, a permanent part of the firmament now of the Republican Party. One was permanent offense. He never accepted the premise of the left's argument. And I think you got a lot of that from Reagan. Reagan would never accept, the liberals would say something, he'd say something else. He would never engage in the destructive argument of the establishment. He would instead flip it to his advantage. They'd say, budgets, and he'd say tax cuts, and they'd say, mutually assured destruction. He'd say destroy the Soviet Union. Whatever they said, he would say something different to reframe the argument. And I think Newt has done the same thing. So that was the part of the permanent offense of the Republican Party. I think also corruption, which was obviously reared its head, from the XYZ affair up until the shoddy suppliers of World War II supply, Civil War, the Army. But it was never a part of the permanent argument. And I think that what Newt does is that by going after Charlie Diggs, bringing him down, who was a really, really dirty congressman from Detroit, he was taking kickbacks from his own staff. By then going after St. Germain, who was chairman of the House Banking Committee, who was literally treating the House Banking Committee, he was extorting money from banks that he was regulating. And then the biggest fish of all, Jim Wright, who is the Speaker of the House, the second in line for the presidency. And he's into dirty cattle deals, he's into dirty oil deals, he's into dirty Cadillac deals. His wife is right there with him, and he's just utterly, completely corrupt, just down to his Stetson boots. And after months and months of campaign, and this was a lonely quest when it first started out, nobody wanted to take on Wright because this was a mean SOB who could really wreak havoc on your career. And then as momentum gained, then others joined in, and then finally, Wright resigns. The first speaker in the history of the House of Representatives to resign, the second in line for the presidency of the United States. It's covered live on all three networks, his resignation from the House. That's how big it was. And then, just to make sure that everybody knew he meant business, then he went after Tony Coelho, who was in the House leadership, who was also pretty corrupt. He was into Drexel Burnham and illicit stock deals and all this. Forces his resignation. And I think now is that Donald Trump, part of the inspiration of Trump draining the swamp, finds its origins in Newt going after these four Democratic members of the leadership. So permanent offense, corruption, those are but two of the permanent paradigms that he introduced to the Republican Party.
You mentioned the media coverage of all of this, and of course, I think back to C-SPAN. And maybe, Newt, you might talk a little bit about what you saw there as a means of communication and how important that turned out to be for the Republican minority.
It's really interesting. You could draw a parallel between the liberating impact of C-SPAN starting in April of '79 and the liberating impact of Facebook and Twitter on somebody like Trump. I think it's very likely Trump could not have won if there wasn't social media.
Right.
Similarly, I don't think we would have emerged without C-SPAN. And I'd been particularly attuned to it because I'd read Halberstam's book on the powers that be, which had a chapter on why Sam Rayburn was determined to not allow television coverage of the House, that he thought it would permanently change the House. It would shift power to people who were really good at making political arguments, and it would dramatically reduce the power of chairmen and the insiders and so forth. And so I happened to arrive like 3 months or 4 months before you end up with C-SPAN opening up. And I very early intuited that there were people around the country who were willing to watch C-SPAN. I mean, it's on a good day, it ranges between boring and you can't believe how boring. But there are people who are fascinated by the process, and so we began very early, and C-SPAN said they have well over 1,000 hours in the archive at Purdue of various things I've done on the floor over the years. And we began very early developing, doing 1 minutes and doing special orders and what have you. And then, thanks in part to Tony Dolan, who was Reagan's chief speechwriter, we had a very close relationship where I would go down, we would have lunch with all the speechwriters and plot strategy for the next 6 to 8 weeks. Then I would go back and do special orders, outlining the strategy, and then they would write the speeches, and then I'd put the speeches in the record. And so you had a constant process of mutual reinforcement, which worked pretty well. And most of my colleagues, even today, most of them don't get it. I mean, I would always say to them, how far would you fly to speak to 1,000 people or to 500 people? How many hours would you travel to speak to an audience that size? Well, we had 250,000 people watching us for walking across from the Cannon building to the Capitol. And you had you had an hour of no competition to get out your ideas, your thoughts, your messages. And it was just extraordinary, and they just didn't get it. And I think still don't, mostly.
Craig, I have to ask now, have you looked at all 1,000 of those hours of
No.
Newt?
No, that's for the next book.
Okay, it's volume 2. Right?
No, but I got enough of a flavor of what they did with the special orders, which was, and it was not, they weren't 90-minute, wasn't Gladstone as Disraeli. They were usually special orders were what, 5, 7, 10 minutes speeches, and it was free. You know, I think he once told, armies, and you'd go, give a speech to 100,000 people, wouldn't you? So why not walk across the street? And it was Vin Weber, it was Jack, it was Army, it was, there's a coterie of real Reagan warriors, and I think you touched on, is the White House, this is another thing I discovered, I didn't realize how much the Reagan White House depended on Newt and Jack, most especially, but also Vin.
Jack.
Kemp,
Yeah,
right. Somebody had to carry the water on Capitol Hill, on the House side, because Bob Michael just wasn't up to it. Good man, terrific voice, but, he was not, a conservative warrior. He just wasn't, he was too friendly with Tip O'Neill. He was too friendly with the opposition. And Reagan needed somebody who was going to fight on tax cuts, SDI. Big issue was contra aid, because a lot of people just didn't want to touch it, because the political establishment said, no, we can't arm the Nicaraguan Contras. It's politically incorrect. It's, whatever. So, and a lot of these critical battles were won because of the work of these. O'Neill used to dismiss them as Reagan's robots and the crazies and other pejoratives, and that you couldn't spray paint on an overpass, but they got the job done. Oftentimes they got the job done.
Talk to us a little bit about the contract with America and how that came about, and why did you pick those particular issues? How much was polling involved in that? And just how did they come about?
Well, I mean, one of the areas that I think is the least known about how I operated was that starting in the spring of 1979, I worked with the Army's Training and Doctrine Command on designing and training and implementing doctrine for warfighting. And one of the most decisive moments of my career was August, I think it was August of '88. I spent a week at Fort Irwin in the desert. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was watching a battalion planning to go to contact, 550 professionals. And it was chaos. And these were all people working very hard. They were all trained, but it was just really hard. And I turned to General Hartzog, who was my mentor, and I said, this is amazingly difficult. And he said, yeah. He said, that's what historians don't understand. That, you can draw a line and say, Lee moved from here to here. But first of all, Lee had to create an army. And then you had to figure out what were the roads like, and how are you going to move the artillery, and what's going to happen with the wagons. I mean, all these pieces. Well, what it taught me was that if you're going to do a nationwide campaign, because the House is really different than running for president. Running for president, you have a central figure and a support team. Trying to run a House national campaign, you have 435 candidates who you don't control, about a third of whom don't know anything. I mean, they're nice, well-meaning people, and on Tuesday they decided they'd run for Congress. And so you have to design a campaign sufficiently clear and sufficiently simple that average, everyday people can learn it. Second, you have to design a campaign because you know the news media is against you. So every issue has to be 70 or 80% to your advantage so that even when they get done, you're winning. So for example, welfare reform has always been a winning issue in America. By the time we were done, it was at 92% approval. So we sat down and wrote up the contract to have a series of things that could be memorized by normal people, each of which was 70% or better. That was the cutoff. If you were below 70, you didn't make the contract. If you allowed us to be redefined by the New York Times, you didn't make the contract. So for example, there's nothing in the contract about abortion, and there's nothing in the contract about school prayer. I happen to be strongly pro-life, and I'm very much in favor of voluntary school prayer. I think we'd be a better country if we had it. But I also knew those two would allow the New York Times to ignore every popular issue and polarize on us as social right-wingers, and we frankly would not have won. So we designed a contract that was very clear, that was very memorizable, and that by brute repetition could help create a wave. And part of my goal has always been that you want a wave election where the candidate, and I did this in 1980 with Mac Mattingly, for example, in Georgia, where I helped create the first Capitol Steps event, which was with Ronald Reagan. It wasn't 94 with the contract, it was 1980 with Reagan. And the goal was Mac Mattingly was going to get within 3 or 4 points of beating Talmadge and lose. But if you could create a wave effect, it'd get him the last 4 points. And to do that, he had to come up and stand near Reagan and be part of a team and be seen as bigger than just the Georgia candidate. And so we designed the whole thing around that. We picked up 6 U.S. Senate seats for a combined margin of 75,000 votes. Nobody thought we'd win control of the Senate. We won the Senate in 80. So now I'm applying basically the same model to a huge nationwide project. We had candidates in every seat except 2. So we had, and our goal there was very simple. We wanted to spread the Democrats on the theory, 1, we're going to get some of them, and 2, that the senior people will become hogs. They'll get scared and they'll take all the resources, leaving the weaker members with no resources. So we beat Ross Stankowski in downtown Chicago, chairman of Ways and Means. We beat Jack Brooks in the Houston suburbs, chairman of Judiciary. For the first time since 1854, we beat the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley. So we're both picking up seats the average consultant would tell you don't even try. We're winning seats and we're absorbing all the resources because Foley faced with survival ain't giving the money to freshmen who are in trouble. So we picked up 53 seats. But there's another part to this. Chuck Schumer wrote a book about 2007. I can't remember the name of it right now. But it was his explanation of middle-class politics. It has the best single chapter written on the contract. Because Schumer understood something nobody in the Republican Party understood. The contract's a management device. It is a deliberate radicalization of the House party. Because if you walk up and you sign a document that says, I'm going to do these things, you are no longer in the go along to get along good old boy party. You've now decided you're leaving Georgetown and you are for real change. And that lasted about 3.5 years. But it was, for 3.5 years, it was a very different party. And we got a lot done. Balanced the budget for 4 straight years, reformed welfare, biggest capital gains tax cut in history, reformed the Communications Act, reformed the Food and Drug Administration. You know, we had a lot of different things going on.
House Bank, Post Office.
Yeah.
It
Chairman
also
Mitchell,
helped
chairman.
that Bill Clinton helped to nationalize it or go along with your nationalization of the issue too.
Well, Clinton is an interesting anomaly. Clinton is a Arkansas governor who was used to dealing with legislatures, who himself had tried to move the Democratic Party towards the center. And so he is totally different from Obama, and he's totally different from Hillary. And of course, they revile him for it. I mean, you know, when he signed the welfare reform bill, the left wing of his party just went crazy. But Clinton helped some to nationalize it, but every place he helped to nationalize it, it was because he went along with the left. It was the left's tax increase. It was the left's crime control bill. I mean, these were all places where Clinton was, in fact, leaving his Arkansas roots and allowing George Mitchell and Tom Foley and Dick Gephardt to carry him into left-wing policies, which blew up. And so that made '94 a referendum, first inside the Republican Party, could you get people to line up and do it? And second, a referendum, do you really want to keep going down this road? And that's the referendum we won that November, which is still too remarkable. If you had asked me in '94, did I think that we would have so decisively shifted the center of power that there would only be one 4-year period of Democrats in the next 23 years, 24 years, I don't think I'd have thought. I mean, this has really been considering that they were in charge for 40 straight years, and we only held it twice. Between 1928 and 1994, we held the House for two terms of 2 years each, and then that entire period. So it really was a much more decisive shift than I would have guessed.
It was
Greg, would you agree with that? Yeah.
part of the,
Yeah.
just want to add to this,
Yeah,
is that it was also very much a referendum on Reagan. And you said so at the time, and everybody was, and a lot of people were giving speeches and running commercials saying so at the time. It was a referendum on Reaganism versus Clintonism, and so that also aided the Republicans in '94.
So would you agree with Newt that it was that significant an event in the last 20, 30 years?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, I would rate it with Goldwater's nomination, '64, Reagan's speech to the '76 convention. These are galvanizing events for the American conservative movement, and sets history off on a completely different arc from the way it was headed beforehand.
You've just come, I believe, Newt, from the White House, so we have to have a
I wouldn't
question.
exaggerate that. I wasn't sitting there with Trump, who is totally focused right now on Las Vegas.
Okay,
And the White House, but the White House just sounds so nice.
right. So talk to us a little bit about this extraordinary president. How extraordinary is he, and how do we manage him, or don't we manage him?
I don't think you do, and I think I agree with a formula I've heard Craig use, that you get an initial eruption with Goldwater, and I think the Reagan October '64 speech is one of the
Absolutely.
decisive moments
Yes.
in this growing sense of, and what's beginning to happen is an alternative center of authority is beginning to build in reaction to what had been the dominant establishment since 1932, and a bipartisan dominant establishment. You then get, in Reagan, a pretty decisive change agent. I mean, focused on a handful of key things, very disciplined, but nonetheless, really an abrupt change on economic policy, an abrupt change on the importance of American history and culture, an abrupt change in terms of the defeat of the Soviet Empire. I mean, Reagan is not a warmed over Nixon or a slightly different version of Bush. He really does represent the maturation of a different way of thinking about things. And then you have a brief interregnum back to the Bushes, who really represent the old establishment and who promptly wipe out every Reaganite they can find, and who so misunderstand the nature of America that they think they can, read my lips and not have a consequence. And then you get Clinton, who gives us this remarkable opportunity. Because Clinton does create, I agree with Craig, Clinton creates such a vivid contrast with Reagan. And it's significant. We didn't run on Bushism versus Clintonism because it wouldn't have worked. But you could run 4 years later, you could run in '94, basically 6 years after Reagan had left office, on Reaganism versus Clintonism. And
But it wouldn't have worked if Clinton hadn't gone to the left.
oh, that's right.
If Clinton had stayed as a New Democrat, the contrast would have been
That's right.
much more difficult to make.
Both Clinton and Obama had a brief moment when the country was willing to believe in them.
Right.
And in both cases, they go to the left.
Right.
Now, the difference is When Clinton gets beat, he comes back to the right because he figures out that, as he said to his staff, if he did what they wanted, he wouldn't survive. And having lost the governorship in Arkansas, he understood that if you lose, you don't get the airplane, the helicopter, the White House. I mean, there's a very grim personal experience. So Clinton was not prepared to die for the old cause.
Right.
So we come along, and I think it's fair to say we're genuinely disruptive in the way, in a parallel to Reagan, but probably in a more populist and a more combative manner. Okay. Then you have another interregnum where the old order takes over. And then you get a very left-wing president, the most left-wing president in American history. And out of that, starting with the Tea Party in 2010, you actually get a revival of a militant grassroots conservatism in a way that we just saw magnified in Alabama. I keep telling people, the establishment theoretically would say, as Trump is more clearly Trump-like, things will move back towards the center. Well, in Alabama, they just moved to the more disruptive side of Trump. And may be a sign that targeting the congressman who had run was a mistake because it created the vacuum for Judge Moore to arrive. And Judge Moore is far more disruptive than the congressman would have been. So you have a very interesting phenomena building. And I give you this as background because I think you have to see Trump in the framework of Goldwater and Reagan and the contract in '94. And I think, modestly, in terms of my presidential campaign in 2012, a lot of the stuff I did in taking on the media is the precursor to what Trump did in 2015 and 16. And you can go back and look at things I was doing come up. Now, he's better at it than I am. He also had $70 or $80 million. But he's an extraordinarily gifted public educator and public figure. And people tend to forget that this is a man who has an intuition about what he can get done. And so far, he's been more right than anybody else has been.
You and Romney was a continuation of the split in the Republican Party, the permanent split in the Republican Party. And it came obviously to a head with the fight over taxes in 1990, where Bush wanted to raise taxes and throw away read my lips, and you and 100 whatever Republicans said, gee, Mr. President, what about your campaign pledge? And he threw it away. But it's a continuation that exists today of Taft and Eisenhower and Goldwater and Dewey, or Goldwater and Rockefeller, Reagan and Bush, Gingrich and Romney, and it continues even today.
How optimistic or pessimistic, Newt, are you about, let's say, first the country, secondly the party, and third the movement? And are they separately considered, or are they all together?
Yeah, no, I think you have to consider them separately. Look, I'm very optimistic strategically about the country. But remember, this is a country which on Christmas Day, 1776, was down to about 2,500 people in Washington's army, of whom a third did not have shoes. This is a country whose most articulate president was rallying the North through unbelievable levels of violence. This is a country which was called to a day of prayer by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the 6th of June because we launched the largest, most complex operation in human history. So, I mean, there is an immense amount of effort and an immense amount of sacrifice that is required of a free people. Now, I'm strategically optimistic because I think 315 or 320 million free people in the end are going to decide that Chinese authoritarianism and Islamic dictatorships aren't acceptable futures. And so we will eventually, in our own good time, to paraphrase Churchill, get our act together. But remember, we occasionally do this fairly late and with a fair amount of bloodshed. I mean, it's not. I don't think life is going to be easy for Americans. I think there are very profound problems out there, and that the polarization around Trump is just a taste of what's coming, because the truth is that the left is so out of touch with reality that every time you try to tell the truth, you're automatically smeared and insulted and attacked. And there is a radicalization underway in which the most vile language can be used to describe the President of the United States, and it's considered a joke on Saturday Night Live. You know, and I think that's the kind of thing, you just have to be aware of this, okay? And you have to understand we're going to have to fight our way through it, and it's going to be a real fight. So if you had said to me in early 1861, was I optimistic about the future of the Union, I would have said yes. I would have had no idea that it meant the hardest war we fought, and it would take 4 years. So I'll say the same thing to you. I think the party will evolve. I think we don't quite understand how it's evolving right now. But I think that you'd mentioned earlier C-SPAN. Part of what social media is allowing is for self-organizing conversations on a scale that we've only begun to experiment with and to understand. And I think you're going to see more of this stuff. And I think it partly depends on who frames the choices. For example, I really believe in the work ethic. And I think we need a real argument about the work ethic. One of my favorite political figures is Mary Mayhew, who led the reform effort in Maine, where they decided that if you got the SNAP card, which is follow-on to food stamps, if you're an able-bodied adult with no dependents, that you had to work in order to get your SNAP card. Well, once they put in work, which was just going back to what we did in '96, but once they put in which by the way was what Reagan advocated in '66, to show you how these continuums occur. Once they put in that provision, out of the 14,000 able-bodied adults with no children, 13,000 went to work and got off the program. So I think we have a whole series of these things coming down the road that people don't want to talk about, and that if we have the guts to talk about them, this was one of the underlying thematics of Citizen Newt, that I was always prepared to talk bluntly about things that were politically incorrect. So we had a committee chairman who had been convicted on 29 counts of stealing $70,000 from his employees, and he was still voting. And I said, that's totally wrong. I mean, how can you have a convicted felon? He was out on appeal, but once you're convicted, you've lost the presumption of innocence. I said, how can a convicted felon, this is about to come up with Menendez in the Senate, it'll be quite interesting. And the Senate Democrat answer will be he can't vote, but he shouldn't resign because they don't want Christie to appoint his successor. But so I went to the Republican conference. I'd been there, I guess, 3 months. And I said, you know, this is just not acceptable. And the first thought that the leadership had was, how can you have a Georgia congressman, because I moved to expel him, how can you have a Georgia congressman move to expel a black Democratic chairman from Detroit? And I said, well, I'm an Army brat who was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and he's a crook. and literally one by one, I mean, one of the most important early conversations, the most influential member of my freshman class was Dick Cheney, who had been the youngest chief of staff to a president. And one of the most important conversations, I sat down with Cheney, he said, look, here are the facts. And he said, if you move it, I'll vote for it. And that gave me a credibility beyond just being a demagogue. Right. And then we had somebody you'd remember, I'm trying to pull up his name, from Roanoke, who was on the Judiciary Committee, a great, great Republican congressman, who...
Not Butler.
Yeah.
Butler?
Yeah.
Okay.
He got up and gave a speech on why, on the floor of the House, on the record, on why I was right and why you shouldn't have convicted felons voting. Well, that really broke the back of the old order. And by then I'd been there, 6 months.
Well, I know we could keep on listening. But I think perhaps what we ought to do is turn to the audience and look for questions. Please, no speeches, and identify yourself. We have one here.
Yes, Speaker, my name is Kami Burton. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is, why didn't you meet the expectation of many Democrats who were expecting that you would go after Congressman DeLay, Dick Armey, and John Boehner? I mean, you are so powerful that one time I gave ride to my then girlfriend. She saw you on the airport, and she was so excited. And I asked her, you are Democrat? She told me you are more powerful than Bill Clinton because you are the one who were making things happen in Washington, and he was taking credit. And I also remember one time I sent a negative email to Sandy Brock, and she asked me to take her name off. I mean, people feared you. But still, you didn't do against the three people anything who went after you. Thanks.
Was in my style. I mean, I didn't want to run a police state. I didn't want to build a machine. One of our New York members, when we first got a majority, said, "Oh, you should organize it this way. This is how the leader in New York controls everything." And I said, I couldn't imagine wanting to control everything. And I would much rather have served 4 years in what was a very free-flowing, very open, and very creative operation than a lot of what followed it, which was very boring and dull, and the average member was intimidated by the leadership and told to keep their mouths shut. And that's just my style. I mean, I really believe in having lots of people. I also understood fully Max Weber's argument that the bureaucratic politician always beats the charismatic politician. And I had no interest in being a bureaucratic politician. That wasn't who I was capable of being.
Yes, please. Here.
Joe Postel, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and Heritage. To paraphrase Newt Gingrich in 1990, many people still think Congress is a sick, corrupt, and broken institution. I was wondering if, based on the experience of the contract with America, whether you still share that assessment, and if maybe you have any advice for people who would look to reform Congress to make it work a little bit better than maybe it is working today.
Well, I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to yield to Craig, because he might have a different view. I think Congress is substantially less corrupt. I think you have to go back and realize when you had the Speaker of the House routinely breaking the law, and you had a number of people doing things that were just plain illegal, and some of it happened. I mean, I think frankly, I was very concerned with the way DeLay was operating towards the end of his career, because I think you can't have a free society that operates out of coercion and bribery. I mean, by definition, those deny the potential for a free society. And so you've got to always be fairly rigorous in taking that on. But my sense is that Menendez is an aberration right now more than he would have been 20 years ago. But it's also important to realize how much the system changed. When we took over in '94, we brought in one of the major accounting firms and asked them to review the House books. And after 6 months, they came back and said, we can't. There are no House books. The House from 1789 on had never kept organized books. And we said, all right. They said, now if you'll hire us, we'll create House books, which we can then in the future audit, which we did. But literally, I mean, it was a period, for example, and this is what, guys got in trouble for things that were part of that world, okay? There's a scene in Jimmy Breslin's How the Good Guys Finally Won, and this is a very liberal book about Tip O'Neill as a great heroic figure taking down Richard Nixon. And early in the book, they have a younger Tip O'Neill with John F. Kennedy at a presidential fundraising event. And they go into the men's room and Kennedy says, you give me the cash and you keep the checks. This is just an anecdote in the middle of the book. I mean, and nobody at the time thinks, okay, what do you mean? You just handed the cash over? We had Senator Talmadge, who had cash in his pocket because, a lobbyist would come up and give him cash, and he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was doing what people did. They had a rule that if you didn't use all your postage, you could take it as money. So at the end of each year, guys who had not used all of their postage would cash in their stamps. And I don't think they reported as income. But that was the norm. That wasn't people who thought of themselves as corrupt. They were doing the usual and customary ways of dealing with life. I think you'd find today that they're much more boring. They're much more disciplined. There's much less of the old line things. And probably that makes it, in some ways, a healthier place.
Mark Twain once called Congress America's only native criminal class. There's, I'm also reminded too about the House Bank, about, I don't know if you remember the Abscam sting, in which 5 or 6 members of Congress were targeted by faux Arab sheikhs who were bringing in suitcases full of cash, and they had it all on film. And actually it's quite hysterical because there's one scene where a congressman and his aide actually get into a fist fight with each other over who's going to take more cash from the faux Arabs out of their handing it out of their suitcase. I mean, they're just pushing each other. There's moral crime and there's legal crime. And I would agree with Newt is that there's less legal crime per se by Congress. But there's also, they have an obligation. They took an oath of office. They're supposed to be doing things. Besides just answering constituent mail, they were elected for a reason. And I perceive that a lot of things that are not getting done because they don't want to get them done. And therefore, they're violating their oath of office. And so, look, Trump is the president. You can argue about it, but the fact is the president leads. The president proposes, the Congress disposes. That's the way it's supposed to work. And they are not doing that. And so, in a way, it's a moral crime that they are not enacting the legislation that clearly the American people want. I'll be curious to see if they do anything on tax reform because they haven't done anything on anything else. I don't know. They took the longest vacation in the history of the Congress, right? Isn't that the longest?
I don't know.
I think it took the longest vacation in the history of the Congress. And I think that's immoral, is that they're elected to do a job, they're supposed to be doing a job, and they're not doing the job.
Yes, please. Some questions here.
My name's Eric Jenkins. I'm a student at East Carolina University. First off, as a moderate Democrat, I do really appreciate Congressman Gingrich. I think you had a stroke of genius in the Congress for your time and really using C-SPAN to your advantage to push your agenda. Actually, Senator, it's funny because Senator Bernie Sanders actually praised you as well for that, and he's trying to do that now with NBC. But my question to you is, do you consider Donald Trump to be a conservative in the classical sense, and where do you see the conservative movement going, and how it'll shape the Congress?
Yeah, I think Trump is not a conservative in the classical sense. I think Trump is anti-left. I think he's anti-politically correct. I think that he is anti-stupidity. And he's a very, very deeply patriotically American. But I would say that in the classical sense of people who read conservative ideology, he doesn't have a clue and doesn't really want to have a clue. It's not who he is, not how he thinks. I think the conservative movement is in many ways fractured at the moment, and fractured for lots of different reasons. And I think that there'll be a sorting out that may take 10 or more years. Or it may work faster than that. I don't know yet. But I think that it sort of resembles what's happening in the entire planet. I mean, if you look at the German election, if you look at the French election, if you look at Abe calling a snap election in Japan for next month, I mean, all around the industrial world, you look at what happened in Catalan, where they are having an independence movement despite the active opposition of the Spanish government. All around the industrial world, people are confronting change on a scale that we don't have any way of organizing solutions for. And we don't even have any way of discussing some of them. And I think that's going to continue for a while, and it's going to get, my judgment is it will get more chaotic and more disruptive before it starts shaking out, because the current scale of our solutions is about 25% of the scale of our problems. And so I think that poses very large problems. And you have, in much of the modern world, very intense oppositional groups, both on the right and the left, who have no interest in finding solutions.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Gil Capon, American Jewish International Relations Institute. I found the discussion of the atmosphere that existed in the House before '94 very interesting. I was the Republican staff on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I worked for Dan Burton. And my recollection is that for a lot of Republicans in the leadership at that time, it was almost like Stockholm Syndrome, or better, people were accepting permanent minority status. So your ideas really were revolutionary. And the other thing is that I can't remember which Democrat it was ordered the cameras to show
O'Neill.
empty seats. Was it?
Speaker O'Neill.
Tip O'Neill.
Speaker.
Right, to show that you weren't talking to anybody. So they obviously didn't get it to who you actually were talking to. My question is, you've written a lot of books yourself. Why did you not write this book by yourself?
I think for two reasons. One, Craig is a
I need something to do.
well, I mean, Craig is a genuine historian. I have such great admiration for the work he's done on Reagan, and such. I'm in awe of the work he did on December '41. It's a remarkable book. So, you know, somebody like, you know, and frankly, prior to Craig, I never thought about trying to find somebody because I think this is an important story about how America evolves, and I think it requires somebody of impeccable research who is willing to have clear opinions, but also willing to argue. And I thought in that sense that he could do the job, and I couldn't. There are three reasons. The second is, he can tell you something about me, and it's more believable than if I tell you something about me. So there's self-written memoirs have a different goal than history.
Truman wrote an excellent autobiography, 3-volume set, and yet everybody refers to McCullough's book on Truman because it's a different perspective.
Right. And so that's part of it. And the other part is I'm still really, really busy trying to invent the future. I mean, I spend 7 days a week working on, I have a piece that'll come out in the very near future on Puerto Rico beyond the current disaster. I have a piece on the Iranian agreement and getting the president not to recertify it. And I'm doing 5 or 6 other things that are parallel to that. So I'm totally immersed, particularly because of Trump won. Now, I mean, I think had Hillary won, I'd have had more time to write a memoir. But because Trump won, and because we have the House and the Senate, there are opportunities here to move things. You know, I mean, I've been working on the tax bill, for example, because I think it is absolutely essential that we get a tax bill done by Thanksgiving. And that's a huge project, and that's one of the things I was talking to people at the White House about this morning.
You know, I do just add on the tax bill, because it reminded me of, because a lot of comparisons are being made to Reagan right now and his tax cuts. You know, people forget how deeply Reagan thought about things and how well read he was. You know, a group of us are trying to endeavor to prevent Reagan from being reduced to a one-dimensional figure of a funny man who told jokes or whatever. He was actually, you know, more reflective than that. In '81, he was pitching a group of conservatives here in Washington about his tax cuts. And he said, yeah, it's about the economy and it's about jobs and this. But he said, what it's really about, he said, it's about rearranging man's relationship to the state. Now, A, that's a very profound thought. B is, other than Newt Gingrich and a couple others, who actually talks like that anymore. But this is what the Republican Party has gotten away from is the appealing intellectualism of personal freedom and anti-state power and pro-individual power. And I think that it starts with Trump, but it seems like there's that a lot of Republicans also don't get this argument now, is that the reason for tax cuts is that you don't want Washington to have too much power. You want to have your own power. And I think that argument it's such a winning argument, and it's such an attractive argument, and it's eluding a lot of Republicans right now, is that precisely why they're Republicans, because they're pro-freedom, they're anti-state power. So it just something occurred to me. You know.
One final question, the lady there, please.
I'm Kathy Martin from the state of Oregon, and I'm here today to listen to this conversation. And my question to Mr. Gingrich is, do you think a lot of the party divisiveness and problems is due to too much media coverage or not enough?
I don't know that it's either. I mean, I think every generation has to come to grips with the media of its time. The Jacksonians relied very, very heavily on weekly newspapers, and in fact franked them using the official congressional frank, and would send out an amazing volume of newspapers. Lincoln arrives at the moment that the Telegraph and the Rotary Press are making the daily newspapers matter. And he really adapts to daily newspapers in a way that is an astonishing example of change. Theodore Roosevelt understands the rise of the Associated Press and knows that Sunday nights are a very bad, very slow time. And so Theodore Roosevelt, almost every Sunday night, did something. You know, and he would get huge coverage because he'd figured out. Franklin Roosevelt wants to communicate how dynamic he is, and so he goes on radio, which is the dominant medium of his time. Reagan was a genius at television. Trump has figured out that Facebook and Twitter give him a reach that is larger than any of the networks. And so he is a force in his own right that we've never quite seen on that scale. So I think every generation has to figure it out. And you do everything. I just did a course called Defending America, which is an experiment. And it's an online course, and it's like $50 or something. When we're testing, it has 6 segments on the Second Amendment, religious freedom, America as a melting pot. And there is a market for, 5 hours of material that you can download on the internet. And it's a very specific now. That's not over here there's a market for 140 characters. And over here there's a market for Snapchat. And part of that is the enormous diversity of America. But remember, the greatest campaign brochure ever written is the Federalist Papers, which are written as a campaign brochure. They're written at a time when probably only 1/3 of the country can read. But that 1/3 would read, and they would talk with the 2/3 that didn't read. And so you have a diffusion of ideas and a dialogue that changes history. And in that period, by the way, it was the pamphlet that mattered most, which is why common sense is such a huge...
Bestseller.
Huh?
Became a bestseller.
Yeah, it's just reprinted over and over and over again because it was the right delivery for that era. So I think the problem is not the amount of noise; it's the lack of ideas. I think a lot of what we do today is junk because people are filling space and time.
Let me just add to that too, is that imagine a world not too long ago where all the news and information that you receive is controlled by 3 major networks and a few daily newspapers and a few wire services. That was a dangerous concentration of power. We should all, as conservatives, embrace the democratization of communications because it allows all of us access to the media, all of us ability to speak out, and it may divide us, but we've been divided since 1775 anyway. This nonsense that I hear these, these jerks on MSNBC talking about, Trump dividing us. And 1776, there are political historians or historians who will tell you that a majority of Americans were against the revolution and in favor of staying with the British Crown. 1812 was about our divisions. 1860 was about our very divisions. Is that entry into World War II, there were 36 members of Congress who voted against our entry into World War I. World War II, there's only 2 times in the history of this country we've actually been united, briefly. December 7th, the afternoon of December 7th, 1941. The country is completely united, and it's expressed in a vote by Congress the next day. Only from Montana. Jeanette Rankin, thank you, votes against our entry. And she's the only one who votes against declaring war against Germany and Italy several days later. But we were divided over Vietnam, we were divided over the Cold War. We've always been divided. That's part of our strength.
When Lincoln took office, 9 states seceded from the...
That's right, exactly. Yeah, but that's my point. Is that the Civil War was about our very division over the issue of slavery. And so this idea, don't ever buy this nonsense that the left tells you is that, well, we need to unite the country. The country's never been united.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are here not only to have a wonderful conversation and listen to these wonderful gentlemen talking about our politics and our society, but also to sell books. we are here to sell books. This is not junk. This is called Citizen Newt. It's by Craig Shirley. It is about our esteemed guest. And I suspect that if you go out there and buy a copy for $25, that either both or one of these gentlemen would be happy to sign it for you. How much longer we can hold on to the speaker, I don't know. But please join me in thanking them for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Good. Good stuff.